I said I was going to go through 3 basic ways that people try to develop a worldview to counter Christianity, and we dealt only with the first one, atheistic materialism. It is our job today to get through Platonic dualism and various religious worldviews as well. I told you that the argument in favor of the Christian worldview is that without it you can't prove anything. You want to know how to prove Christianity? You counter to your opponent. Without the Christian worldview, you can't prove anything. Now that's easy to say, someone might say, but how do you know that? Because without the Christian worldview, there's no basis for induction, scientific inference based on causality. Without the Christian worldview, there's no basis for class concepts and laws of logic by which we would reason deductively. Without the Christian worldview, man does not have a mind by which he investigates options and chooses the truth based on evidence. He has only a brain which is controlled by electrochemical processes. So he can't help but say what he does. That is to say, if the materialist is right, he has no reason for believing that he's right. He just has a brain that forced him to say and think what he does. And finally, without the Christian worldview, there could be no moral absolutes. Even the moral absolute that says you can't cheat in your lab, reports, your statistics, or take out a gun and shoot your opponent to win an argument. Those things cannot be excluded unless you have a basis for moral absolutes. And of course, the atheist has no basis for moral absolutes. The atheist might say, well, if we don't respect one another, if we start shooting each other, then just think how unhappy society will be. To which you can say, if you want to argue this point, yes, society will be unhappy, but so what? Why am I under obligation to work for the happiness of society? So, to make a long story, yesterday's long story, very short here in these first 5 minutes, we have destroyed the atheistic worldview. At the end of yesterday's lecture, I said, however, when you use arguments of this kind with an atheist or materialist, you mustn't expect that they're just going to say, oh, well, I guess, I'm destroyed. That's right. I'll have to become a Christian. Sometimes it happens like that. Usually it doesn't. And so I want you, for the first few minutes here, to think about ways in which people try to avoid the pain of their worldview. These are people who have boarded the plane for Boston, and they think they don't have to go all the way. They want to get off at Chicago. And so now I'm going to tell you how you're going to guard the door here and say, nope, no exit. No one gets out at this point. You got on this plane called human autonomy, being a law to yourself. You're going to go all the way unless you turn to the only option there is, and that's Christ. Okay, so what are some of the little strategies that unbelievers will use? Well, if it's a professor, the strategy most likely will be, well, that's not an important question. If you're studying in an area like literature, sociology, or physics, and you start throwing these philosophical problems at your professor, if you get an opportunity to talk to him after class or in his office or something, most likely your professor is going to say, oh, well, that's too philosophical for me. That's not important. Now, by waving his hand and pronouncing it's not important, does the issue become not important? No, I mean, when I put it to you that way, when someone that's been through this will stick around and say, hey, you can't, blow it off like that, then you can see very clearly, well, that's a silly thing. He can't just say it's not important. But he's going to say that, and I'm not going to be there to hold your hand. I'm not going to be there to say, hey, I've got a PhD in philosophy, don't bamboozle me, Answer the question or admit that you're wrong. You're going to have to do that. Of course, you can't do it in the same way. I mean, I wouldn't do it that way anyway, but you can't do it that way. You're going to have to stick with it, and you're going to have to learn a kind of technique that enables you to be very firm in insisting on an issue without being disrespectful. So if he says it's not important, You're going to say, well, but how could we do science without it? Maybe you're right. You just need to help me here. See this. And he'll say, well, this is crucial, please. We are able to do science without answering that question because we are doing science, and I can't answer your question. And he will think that's profound. He will think that has settled it. And the reason why he will think that is not just a slimy way out, although some of your professors will be slimes and try to get out like that, but he will very sincerely think he's put off that question. It's not important because we are out there doing physics. We are out there studying literature. We don't need to answer these problems in order to do the work in our field. And so now I'm going to complicate what I've been teaching you just a bit by explaining to you that this unbeliever that you've been talking to, and it could be a roommate, a fellow student, or a professor, this unbeliever that you've been talking to is a believer. Yeah, the unbeliever is a believer. And because the unbeliever is a believer, he or she will have a good point, in a sense, when he or she says, well, we don't have to answer that question because we're able to do science, we're able to do sociology, we're able to do art without answering your question. Now I got to go back and explain a few things here, right? The unbeliever is a believer. 3 concepts that we have to get under our belt before we're done today. Believing, justifying, having a belief about a belief, or believes about belief. We're going to talk about these 3 things, and then we're going to come back to the unbeliever being a believer. There's a difference between believing something and being able to justify it. Okay? I believe certain things about health in the human body. But if you were to push real hard, you would find that I don't have enough information that I can justify all the beliefs that I have. In many cases, I'll just fall back on, well, this is what my doctor told me. You understand? There's a difference between my believing something and being able to justify it. Now, if I'm not able to justify it, does that mean that it's not true? No, but I certainly can't be very persuasive if I'm not able to offer a justification. But believing something and being able to justify something are 2 different matters. Now, what if I say, I believe that it's 96 degrees outside? How is that different from my saying, I know that it's 96 degrees outside? Anybody? What's the difference between believing a proposition and knowing a proposition?
You know something believes it's true.
Well, if I know it, it must be true. So knowledge is a true belief. Knowledge is a true belief. I can believe things that are false, can't I? I could believe right now that I'm in Bend, Oregon, and that would be false. So knowledge must be a true belief. But now, is that enough? Is every true belief a case of knowledge? How about this? I believe that the winning lottery number tonight will be 68093. We hang around, we watch the TV, the lottery number comes up, and I've won the lottery. That was the number. And I say, I mean, this is common English parlance, but it is not good philosophical analysis. I say, I knew that that would be the number. Did I know it? No. Did I believe it? Well, I believed it enough to buy the ticket. So, yeah, we'd say I believed it. Was it true? Yes, I believed it. It was true. Did I know it? No. What did I lack? Proof. I lacked justification. When I know something, I believe it, it's true, and I have evidence for it. I can prove it, or if you will, I can justify it. Very simply put, Knowledge is justified true belief. Justified true belief. Now, what kind of things can I have beliefs about? Can I have beliefs about aunts and uncles? Can I have beliefs about chemistry? Can I have beliefs about pastry? Can I have beliefs about politics? Can I have beliefs about God? Can I have beliefs about sports? Oh, can I have beliefs about myself? Oh yeah, in fact, that's one of the most important, significant areas of all the beliefs that people have are what they believe about themselves. The vast majority of the work that pastors do in counseling people comes down to what they believe about themselves. And I'm not into this self-esteem as the answer to all your problems thing, but the fact is, when you talk to people who are not acting right toward their children, or there's marital problems, or a person's depressed, or on and on and on, it often has to do with what they believe about themselves. Sometimes favorably, sometimes not so favorably. I'm sure you all know people who believe about themselves that they're pretty hot stuff. And you would say there's not a whole lot of evidence to justify that belief. Okay, so we have beliefs about a lot of things. I am moving to something here, so just hold on. If I give you the building blocks, then we'll be able to get this thing put together. People have beliefs about themselves, and they have beliefs about what they believe. Imagine that someone's doing a survey out on the street. You walk out of the department store and they come up to you. Do you believe that Clinton should be the next president of the United States? Now, you might not have to struggle with that, but let me just play this out, as an intellect, just so you see what the concept is here. Person comes up and says, do you believe such and such and such and such? Now, you're going to, I'll do this in slow motion for those of you who think it's trickery, you are going to stop and say, what beliefs are in the filing cabinet up here? I have to open the drawer on politics and look inside. And then you do that, and you don't find any belief that Bill Clinton should be the next president of the United States, and then you report to the person, no, I don't believe it. Now, in that little farcical scenario, what you did is you consulted yourself about what you think you believe. And you report, I don't believe he should be the next president of the United States, or that he should, if you're mentally ill. I mean, you report your belief as you understand your beliefs, right? Now, the reason why this is going to seem really philosophical and weird is because, for the most part, we don't think we have any problem identifying our beliefs. That is to say, we tend to think we are infallible about what we believe. Not that our beliefs are infallible. Please don't wander off that direction. I said we are infallible about what we believe. That is, I can't make mistakes about myself. We operate on that assumption. Most people would, be a little put out if you suggested that there was a question that they know themselves that well. But on the other hand, once we get away from the initial impression that we are infallible about ourselves, I'll bet you can identify a lot of things you're not so sure about whether you believe. Let's say I work for somebody at IBM in an office, and this person makes a real point about racial equality. Let's say this person is going on and on about how all races are equal and discrimination is horrible, etc., etc. And this person, being the office manager, goes out of his way or her way to make sure that people of other ethnic and racial backgrounds get promoted and so forth and so on. Now, if you were to go up to that person and say, do you believe that people of all races are equal in dignity? That person would almost certainly say, yes, I do. And if you were to say, well, are you sure you believe that? He'd probably get insulted and say, well, of course, I know my beliefs better than anybody else. Yes, I believe in racial equality. All of that seems very plain and easy. But now let me complicate the story. You also are a fairly good friend of the office manager, and after work, you go out drinking together. And so you've got a lot of not only spare time that you've spent with this guy, but it's pretty loose time too. And you notice that when your friend gets a couple of good shots in him, and he starts telling jokes, he doesn't hesitate to tell jokes that involve racial slurs. And demeaning remarks come out of his mouth when he sees people of other races enter the bar and so forth. Now, does your friend believe in racial equality? The first thing that comes to our mind if we hear a story this dramatic, the first thing that comes to our mind is to say, I'm dealing with a hypocrite. I'm dealing with somebody who's putting on a real good show at work, but then after work in the bar, his real feelings come out. And that is a possibility. Well, it's not just a possibility, I mean, that happens. So that could be one explanation, but it's not the only explanation. I'm going to give you a parallel story to make it a little bit easier for you to get into this. Imagine you had a mother. She's a single mother. The husband has died. She's left with one child in this world, and all of her joy and happiness and self-esteem in this world is tied up with that little child. She lives her life through Johnny. Now, I hope you're listening because I'm telling you this happens. But Johnny, her little angel, is a hellion at school. Johnny gets into trouble, and it began with relatively innocent pranks and so forth, but it's now escalated. He's in the 3rd grade, and Johnny is stealing lunch money from the other kids at school. And when Johnny gets caught stealing lunch money and the teacher calls Mrs. Jones to talk about her little angel, she says, my child wouldn't do such a thing. You think that ever happens? Yeah, I bet you've seen it. I bet you've seen your own parents do things like that. Maybe not that dramatic. But let's make it worse. Let's say that she just will not receive the negative reports about her child, and of course the child gets worse. Now it's 5th grade, and Johnny's not just beating up on kids and stealing their lunch money, he's putting razor blades in their apples that they're going to eat for lunch. And now the school says, we've had it. We're not going to put up with this anymore. And the principal calls in Mrs. Jones to explain that Johnny's being expelled from school. And she puts up a fuss like you wouldn't believe, defending her son. Her son has been framed. They've had it in for Johnny for 2 years since they started telling these lies about him stealing lunch money. And on she goes doing this sort of thing. Next time Johnny gets into trouble, she transfers school districts. She's not going to put up with this persecution of her child anymore. And you know one more thing. That is, as much as she praises her little Johnny for being an angel and defends him against all this persecution and false accusation, she'll never let her son be alone with her purse in another room. You're going to have to grow up and not make simplistic judgments. Now, I'm going to ask you, does Mrs. Jones believe in the innocence of her child? Any of you who are nodding your heads yes are wrong. Any of you who are nodding your heads no are wrong. Any of you who are going like this are right. Because what you have in a case like this, what you have in a case like this is a woman who has 2 beliefs. Okay, this is going to be a formula that you hear in this lecture. S believes P. S being a subject, in this case Mrs. Jones. P being a premise or a proposition. In this case, the proposition is that Johnny is a hellion, or is guilty, or is a rat, or whatever you want to say. That is, the proposition has to do with a negative assessment of her son. And I'm saying that she believes her son is not an angel. How do I know that? What was the evidence that I used to draw that judgment? Anybody? She protects her own purse from the brat. That's right. She's not going to let him get hold of her money. And so she believes her son is in some sense immoral. By the way, did she admit that belief? Was the evidence of this belief verbal? No. It was what? Actions, right? Have you ever heard the expression, actions speak louder than words? Sometimes actions are a real good indicator of what people believe, even when they say they don't believe it. And of course, that's the punchline that we're getting to here, but let me finish the little scenario. The second thing that our subject believes, Mrs. Jones, is this. She has a belief about her own beliefs. And it is, she believes that she does not believe P. In the second case, let me just draw a line to make sure we don't get confused. In the second case, we have what's called an iterated belief, a belief about a belief. So you're at a higher level now. It's not just the ordinary beliefs about sports and Johnny and all the rest that she may have, but now we're stepping back and she's looking at herself, in a sense, opening the file drawer. What are the beliefs that I find in there? And she believes that she does not believe that Johnny is a rat. Now, does she have good reason to believe that she doesn't believe that about herself? Sure she does. So do you. Because there's all kinds of evidence that she thinks her Johnny's an angel. I mean, she defends him to the hilt. Transfer school districts, if need be, to protect his integrity and his reputation. I'm going to ask you one other question. Do you think this kind of thing ever happens? Yeah, you're laughing. It happens all too often, and not just with parents and their children. It happens with respect to people who think they believe in racial integration and then are caught their actions speaking louder than their words. They don't really believe in that. So what I'm trying to tell you is a general thing about human nature. Then we're going to come back to the unbeliever who's a believer. It's a general truth about human nature that although we think we are infallible about what we believe, we aren't. And in some, usually, psychologically high stress or high intensity situations, we are often very prone to be wrong about what we believe. Because we've been told that the really progressive or politically correct thing is to believe the following, but in our heart of hearts we don't believe it. And yet we put on the outward show and we want to convince ourselves that that's the kind of person we are, but we aren't. So people can be wrong about what they actually believe. If I were to start with that as my opening statement in the lecture, I think it would have been very hard to swallow. But by going over this with illustrations, piece by piece, you can see, yeah, that isn't all that impossible. Not only that, the sad thing is it's pretty common to human nature. All right, we go back to our atheist professor. Atheist professor of, let's choose a field that's really high on the academic totem pole, psychology. If you think I was insulting the lawyers yesterday, you didn't hear anything about psychologists, okay? But let's say you got a psychological expert. It's almost like military intelligence, right? Contradiction in terms. A psychological expert. And he's an atheist. Okay, so you've been giving him these questions that I've taught you to ask, and he gets frustrated. He can't answer them. He goes, look, I don't know why nature is uniform. I'm not even sure I can justify that belief, but I don't need to. And why didn't he need to? What was the cop-out that I suggested? Because we're doing it. We're doing psychological science. We got to change that. We're doing physical science. We're doing chemistry, and I can't answer your question. So you're wrong. You don't have to know why nature is uniform in order to do chemistry. Okay, the better students here are remembering the distinction that we started out with. Believes and justifies. Now, do I act only on those things that I can justify, or do I act on my beliefs? Imagine a child jumping up out of bed with the thunder and crawling under the bed, and you come in and ask, why he or she did this, and the answer is something about that goes boom in the night, and there are terrible things out there in the dark. Can the child justify that belief? Did the child hesitate to act on that belief? No. And most people don't. Most people don't say, I'm going to wait until I can be absolutely sure of everything and then I'll start acting. We act on our beliefs. So when your atheist physics prof tells you, I've been acting on the belief that nature is uniform, therefore I don't need to justify it, is he making sense? No, in fact, that's a red herring in logic. I mean, he's answering a different question altogether. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And that's what you need to learn to say, to bring all this down to the point. The next step in your conversation is going to be something to the effect, very politely, Professor, I didn't doubt that you believed it. I asked, how do you justify it? You want me to go through that all again, real fast, kind of like wind the tape back? Okay. All right, you got an atheist professor, you've been hitting him about the problem of scientific induction. You say, on your worldview, I don't see how you can justify scientific induction. You've gone through this for a few days. You've bought the cup of coffee every time. You've been very polite. He's been listening to you. He says, you're right. I don't know why nature is uniform. And then you say, okay, well, then I expect you're ready to become a Christian, right? He goes, no, but I don't think it's an important question either. Who cares? Whoa, how can you say you don't care? That's a really crucial philosophical problem, because I don't care because we're out there doing physics even though I don't have an answer to that problem. Isn't that where we left off before we went to the philosophical loop? And now the answer is this. You're going to say, well, Professor, I never doubted that you believed in the uniformity of nature. I've been asking you to justify it. When an unbeliever cannot justify his beliefs, he's being arbitrary. And what are the two major sins from an intellectual standpoint? Arbitrariness and inconsistency. Okay, I hope that I didn't go too fast, because what you've just done is you've devastated him, because all you have to remember is he's distracted you about what he does. That has nothing to do with what he can justify. Okay? But I'm going to make more out of this illustration than just that. As important as what I just said is, far more important is this. You need to drive home to your roommate or your professor's heart, not just that he believes something that he can't justify, but that he believes it because the Bible says he believes in God. It's not just induction, it's deduction as well. We talked about that. It's not just that, it's also the use of a mind rather than just the brain tissue. It's not just that, it's also moral absolutes. Now, let's say you've gone through this little scenario 4 times on those 4 questions. There are other ones, but I've reduced it to 4 for you. You've done this 4 times with your professor. You say, well, Professor, it's obvious from your actions that you believe in the uniformity of nature. It's obvious from your actions you believe in moral absolutes. It's obvious from your actions you believe in logic and class concepts, deductive logic. It's obvious from your actions you believe that man is more than just, brain tissue, that he's mind. How are we going to account for all these things you do? And you open the Bible to Romans 1, for instance. Say, well, here's what the Bible says about why you are acting this way. That you know the truth and you are suppressing it in unrighteousness. Again, I'm not suggesting that you always have to quote that particular verse or even necessarily quote a verse at that point. Let's just take it at that level, though. And whatever way you get that out to him, you think he's going to like that? Because what you have now said about him is something disreputable. But you shouldn't back down. Because that's what apologetics is all about, showing the disreputable reasoning process of an unbeliever. Do you think preachers Well, I shouldn't say do they, because as a sad fact they do. Do you think preachers ought to stop saying disreputable things about people that they might come to the gospel? No, do you think people will come to the gospel unless they understand some disreputable things about themselves? Of course they won't. They've got to understand that they are in rebellion against God. A man who thinks he's healthy doesn't look for a physician. And so I'm trying to make the point that when you get to the place that your professor is now feeling the moral pinch of your witness, that in fact he is intellectually disreputable. He knows things, acts on things, his very behavior shows that he believes these things, and yet he will not admit it. He suppresses it in unrighteousness. Now, at that point, you see, he's either going to have to come up with a justification, or he's going to have to go home and think long and hard about what you've left him with, and that's with God. Your professor may have won prizes in physics because he's so smart. By the way, if he has, you're not likely going to get a lot of time with him. You're going to give the graduate assistant, over to you. But if you were to talk to him, the fact that he has all these prizes in physics would not give him an answer to your question, would it? Little boy who saw the king in his underwear in that parade probably was not well liked by telling the truth. But the fact that your professor doesn't like you, the fact that it makes him uncomfortable, should not change what you need to tell him. Of course, I've been saying professor all along, and it may very well be your roommate or someone else at the university you're talking to in this way. But I wanted to make real clear at the beginning of our talk today that it's not just that unbelievers are intellectually barren in offering reasons for logic and science and morality. It's that they are people that are deceived, self-deceived. I'm just warming up. There's no way only 10 minutes is left in this lecture. I believe that there's 10 minutes left in this lecture, and I believe of myself that I do not believe that, and so I'm going to keep talking. You're going to turn off the microphone, I know. Okay, so self-deception is crucial to understanding Christian apologetics. When you're dealing with somebody who is deceived, and is deceived because he or she is doing the deceiving, you mustn't have the idea that it's going to be this simple little thing that if I go through the philosophical puzzles, then the computer's going to have to admit that it's wrong. Well, if you're dealing with a computer, maybe it'd be that simple, but you're dealing with a person who's running away from God. Now, I want to tell you how badly some people want to run away from God. Some people will actually give up their intellect rather than admit that they've been rebelling against God. It's not the sort of thing you ordinarily see. After all, most people are not pressed to see that they couldn't be reasonable if they didn't have a Christian worldview. But from time to time, there are unbelievers, whether they've had Christians witness to them or not, time to time you'll find there are unbelievers who come up against the implications of unbelief. And they finally have to swallow and just say, okay, that's it. I'll be irrational. I'm going to give you a good illustration. In the field of literary criticism today, the reigning school of thought is deconstructionism. Just out of curiosity, no embarrassment, how many of you know what deconstructionist literary criticism is? Okay. Let me say just a little bit about that. This little model from Jacques Derrida might capture it nicely for initial introduction. Derrida says, every reading is a misreading. Every reading of a text is a misreading of the text. And the reason he says that is, it is impossible in any objective way to ever get back to the original intent of an author. And therefore, all literary interpretation is in fact bringing your own game to the author and dancing on his head. There is no way to get to the bottom of what a text really means. So every reading is a misreading. Why was Derrida forced to that irrationalist position in literary criticism? Because as Jacques Derrida thought more and more about literary interpretation, what's involved in an analysis of what another person has to say, he had to face the fact that there are unchanging absolutes if he believes in literary interpretation. But on his existentialist worldview, there are no absolutes. And it's not just there are no moral absolutes, there can't be unchanging absolutes in language either, or in human nature either, or in historical criticism either. And so if you can't do the historical background, if you can't be sure of the meaning of the terms, and if you don't know human nature to be absolutely constant, then how can you be sure what this author is saying? You can read the author this way, you can read the author that way, and therefore every reading is a misreading. Now, the only reason I bring up deconstruction is that as far as I can see, the deconstructionists were not driven to this conclusion because there was some good presuppositional apologist that lived next door to them who was really putting the heat on them. They weren't being pressed. Well, but they were, of course, in one sense. We sometimes speak of the hound of heaven pressing people. And I don't know whether this is going to be for the sake of their ultimate conversion. But you see, they could not come up against God's world, the world of language and meaning and so forth, and be consistent. And realizing they were being inconsistent, they bit the bullet. Actually, they swallowed it. They said, okay, then there is no meaning. And what happens to language if there is no meaning and every reading is a misreading? Language is a subjective tool and no longer is what we usually call language. What I'm getting at is sometimes people will give up their rationality rather than to give in to the Lord Jesus Christ and to the revelation of God that's all around them. And you will find people that when you talk to them and you push them about their rationality, their science, their moral absolutes, and they cannot give a justification, rather than give in to the only viable option, they'll say, okay, I'll take the plane to Boston. If what you're saying is, my unbelief drives me to irrationality, then to irrationality I will go. Okay? I'm talking to the Hare Krishna in the airport. They don't do that as often as they used to, but we still get that opportunity. And Hare Krishna tells me that, my problem in life is that I'm on this wheel of life, and I'm thinking in terms of distinctions. I have this Western mentality, and I'm being oppressed by that, and I need to realize all is one, and there are no distinctions, and if I don't get that enlightenment, I'll never, get off the wheel of life and finally get to nirvana. And I say, tell me a bit about nirvana. I'd like to go there, maybe. Well, in nirvana, remember the quotation from the Bhagavad Gita I gave you? That's where the drop of water falls into the shoreless ocean. Okay, all is one. There are no distinctions in nirvana. And because we haven't arrived in nirvana, we are now living in the realm of Maya, the realm of illusion. The illusion that you are different from me, that your wallet is different from that the trees and the oceans and all that are separate beings and so forth. Don't you realize we are one with nature, and nature is one with us, and actually there are no distinctions at all. And there's no distinction between good and evil ultimately either. So this is what the person has been telling me in the airport as I'm waiting for my airplane. And I say, okay, now, you have to kind of use the Columbo routine here. So just one more question, one thing I haven't figured out here. Now you say that the problem with me right now is I haven't arrived at nirvana because I still believe in distinctions, like between your wallet and my wallet, and the airplane and me, and the trees and the ocean and all that. Because I still think in terms of distinctions instead of monism. That's why I haven't been enlightened enough to finally get to nirvana, right? Yeah, that's right. You've been listening well. Okay, so then I'm not in nirvana now? I want to make real sure of that. Oh, no, you're not in nirvana now. You're in real sad shape. You're heading for aardvarkness when you come back. Okay. So on your worldview, if I understand you correctly, there are no distinctions. Ultimately, there are no distinctions. Right? Right. Well, then there can't be any distinction between where I am and nirvana either, can there? So that on your worldview, I don't need to do the yoga, I don't need the meditation, I don't need to worry about the wheel of life because I'm already in nirvana. Now what have I just done to the Hare Krishna? Well, I've turned him into a pretzel intellectually, but I've done this because his worldview is contradictory. Now, you may think, well, Dr. Bahnsen, you've done that, a few times. You know how to talk to people and so forth. You probably see a lot of Hare Krishnas and say, okay, well, then I got to look for a different religion, right? Sometimes, praise God, by His grace, the testimony is used, but not always. And here's the important thing. Often, a person who's trained in Eastern philosophy will say, oh, there you go with your Western logic. It's true. I've caught him in a contradiction, and his way of squeezing out is by saying, logic's not important. And so you Westerner, you begging the question Christian, you use logic on me like a trick, but I know better than that, because we've been taught that all is one, and logic is misleading. Now there's a case of a person, when you have done an internal critique of their worldview, ends up saying, I'll give up rationality rather than admit that I'm wrong. Well, I'm not done. Just a little PS, then we're going to take a break. And so I say to the Hare Krishna, I've really got to get to my plane, but I just want to... So what you're saying is you reject logic, is that right? He says, yeah, I reject logic. That's Western. I have an Eastern mindset. I have two responses for him. If I have time before the plane comes, I'll give him both. But here's one of the two responses. You reject logic? Well, then you don't. Catch you later. Meditate on that one. Do you know what I'm getting at? Man who says, I reject logic, has no right to demand logical consistency. And so if he rejects logic, it is not the case that he rejects logic. The minute he rejects logic, he can't argue with me anymore. That means I can say anything I want. And I can say he doesn't reject logic. So if you do, you don't. Okay, I want you, to chuckle and to catch that. But obviously when you're witnessing to the person, you don't want him to just think that's a little joke. I'm telling him this seriously. You can't escape the demands of logic because you can't escape living in God's universe and being God's child. You're going to have to answer to your Father someday. Okay, that's one response. If you reject logic, then you don't. The other response is kind of more sociological and very simple, and that is when he says he rejects logic, I can in essence say, well, then please speak up in the microphone and let everybody know that. I want everyone to know. I mean, if you're not going to be converted, if you're not going to bend the knee here, then at least I want you to testify to the goodness and the truth of God by telling the world that the only way you could avoid becoming a Christian is by rejecting logic. What did Peter tell me my obligation is? To give a reasoned answer to any man who asks me for a reason of the hope that is in me. And so all I am saying to this person is, if you're going to be reasonable, you're asking a reason for why I'm a Christian, if you're going to be reasonable, if you're going to be logical, you have to be a Christian. And so when I get the Hare Krishna to say, well, in a sense that's true, I guess, because if you become a Hare Krishna, you've got to sacrifice logic, I'll take that much from him as well.